Hi there, welcome to this video. In this video, we are going to get started with Ionic and Vue. Ionic, in case you don't know, is basically a library which helps you with building mobile applications, real mobile apps, which you can distribute through the app stores. And Vue.js is a JavaScript library, a JavaScript framework we can use for building modern frontends, modern web applications running in the browser driven by JavaScript. Now with Ionic Vue, we can combine both and we can build real mobile applications with Vue.js. And that's exactly what this video is about. We're going to build this basic application which features a lot of important core features you typically want in your mobile apps, like navigation, forward-backward navigation, and using a device camera, submitting data and storing data. And we're going to build this application whilst learning everything you need to know for getting started with Ionic and Vue. Enjoy the video. So let's get started with Ionic Vue. And the best place to get started really is ionicframework.com. That's the official webpage of the Ionic company and project, and there you got amazing resources. You can learn all about Ionic there. It's also a great place to dive deeper. And on that page, if you go to developers installation, you find detailed instructions on how to work with Ionic in combination with different technologies. So here you can also learn how to use Ionic standalone with just vanilla JavaScript, how to use it with Angular, with React, with Vue, of course, which is what we're going to do in this video here. And you learn about advanced features, about theming, and a lot of stuff. Though, of course, I'm going to walk you through all the important things, all the important bits and pieces in this video. So here, if we go down to Vue on the left part here and to Quick Start, we get an overview over what Ionic is, but then we also find installation steps. Alternatively, you can also go to CLI installation here at the very top below getting started, and you basically find the same steps just in a more general way there. And it all starts with installing the Ionic CLI with npm, which of course means that we need to install Node.js first. Now we also need Node.js because Ionic also will spin up a little development server which allows us to preview our application. We get live reload there and so on, and that will also use Node.js. So make sure you have Node.js installed from nodejs.org, and you can simply pick the latest version here, or the long time stability version should also work. And once you get that installed, I already do have it, you can run this command here. So simply open up your terminal or command prompt and run npm install -g at Ionic CLI in there. If you're getting permission issues on macOS or Linux, you might want to add sudo in front of that. So simply enter your password if you should be prompted, and maybe enter the right one. And that will now install the Ionic CLI on your system, which is simply a little tool the Ionic company gives you, which makes creating Ionic projects, but also running and building Ionic projects easier. Now, once you got that installed, make sure that you switch to a folder on your system where you want to create your new Ionic project. I just did that, and then simply run Ionic start in that path. And Ionic start is a command which will then open up the wizard for creating a new project, which allows you to, well, create that project. And here we first of all have to pick the framework we want to go with. And I will go with Vue here, since this is an Ionic Vue video. So simply select that, hit enter, and then give your project a name, of course. And I will name it Vue First App. But the name, of course, is totally up to you. This will also be the name of the folder which is created for the project, though. Now you can pick a starter template there. You can, for example, start with an application which already has tabs or a side menu, but I will start with a blank application. And this will now basically set up this project folder for you, walk through all the installation steps of installing all the required dependencies, and it will take a couple of moments, and once it's done, you will have your Ionic project set up already. Now, I can already say, whilst this is setting up, Ionic, of course, is a tool, a framework, a library, which we use to build native mobile apps. At least that very often is the goal when you start using Ionic. I also want to say, though, that actually Ionic is not that technology. Ionic is two things. It's the company which built Ionic, so the company is also called Ionic, and Ionic is a library of UI components in the end. So of components that have a certain look and feel and which allow you to build rich user interfaces. And these components happen to look like the native counterparts. So they look like you would expect components to look like on Android or iOS. They also automatically adapt to the underlying operating system to have the proper look. And that's all amazing. But Ionic, the library alone, will not give you a native mobile app. Instead, it will give you a web app. You can build a web app with it because these components which you're using are basically web components, simply then wrapped for the specific framework you're using Ionic with. So in our case, we'll get a bunch of Vue components, which under the hood are just these native Ionic web components, just wrapped with Vue components, so to say. And that's Ionic. So you can build nice looking web applications with Ionic. It's giving you all these components which you need. But to get a native mobile app, you actually need another technology which is also developed by Ionic, the company. And that would be Capacitor. Capacitor is another library, which we haven't installed at this point of time, which in the end allows you to turn any, and that's important, any JavaScript application, any web application, let's say, any front-end web application consisting of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript into a native mobile app for Android and iOS, which you can distribute through the app stores. You don't need to use Ionic to use Capacitor. Often you will, because Ionic gives you the proper look, so to say, but you can add Capacitor to any project, to any front-end JavaScript-driven project, and it will give you that native mobile app. That's really important. Now, we'll come back to Capacitor later, because of course we're going to build native mobile apps here, but we're going to start with just building a web app with Ionic, because Capacitor in the end will then just wrap this web app into a native mobile app. So you get a real native mobile app, but in the end it's this wrapped web app. So back to Ionic. We installed the Ionic CLI, we created the Ionic project, and that of course means we can now open it up in our favorite editor or IDE. Now I did that here. I'm using Visual Studio Code, and in the end here I'm just using the default dark plus color theme if you want that same look. I got a couple of extensions installed. Important here is probably Path IntelliSense, which can help with auto-completing import paths. Prettier for code formatting. Vtour for great Vue.js development, because that's important. We're going to use these Ionic components, but all the logic and all our extra components which we might need will be written with JavaScript and Vue. So we're still building a Vue app here, as you will see. And that's why I have this extension installed. And yeah, that should basically be it. Now, we got our starting project here, and in the end, that's a regular modern front-end project as you know it from Vue, from React, and so on. Just already fine-tuned for Ionic. Now, it actually already did add Capacitor here. You also see it in package.json. I have to correct myself there, but we're not going to use it yet, but soon. So Capacitor is already pre-installed and pre-configured to turn this into a native app. But for a moment, let's focus on Ionic and Vue. And for that, as you see in the package.json, we got Vue installed, version 3. We got the Vue router already installed, and that's the regular Vue router, which you already know. And as a side note, of course, if you want to learn all about Vue, if you need these basics first, then my Vue the Complete Guide course might be just the right thing for you. You, of course, find a link below the video, also with a nice discount. I'm not going to teach Vue here in this video. That's not the goal of it. I'm going to focus on Vue and Ionic. So we got Vue parts and libraries installed, and then we got Ionic Vue installed, and the Ionic Vue router, which in the end is a wrapper around the normal Vue router, just with some extra animations, which have this nice mobile animation look. And that is basically what we got here. And then a bunch of development dependencies for a great development experience. Got a bunch of configuration files here, but then here it's the source folder, which is interesting to us. And we can already see we got TypeScript here. By default, Ionic projects, at the moment at the least, give you TypeScript projects. Because Ionic itself is written with TypeScript, the Ionic team likes TypeScript, and it is a great language. I like it too. But of course, when working with Vue, you might be used to working with just JavaScript. And the good news is you can easily adjust this to have just a Vue JavaScript project with Ionic. You also find adjustment steps in the official docs here. If you go to the Vue part, Quick Start, and then here, build your way with TypeScript or JavaScript. Here you find instructions on how to move from TypeScript to JavaScript. And that's what I'm going to do. So I'll first of all run this command here inside of my project. So here in the terminal, navigate it into this project to basically uninstall all TypeScript specific packages, because we don't need them if we don't use TypeScript. As a next step, we basically need to change all TS extensions to .js, obviously. And we only have two files which we need to adjust. That's the main JS file, and then here in router, the index.ts file, which I changed to index.js. Now, this shims-vue DTS file can simply be deleted. You also find this script, this step here. And we also can and should edit our ESLint.rc JavaScript configuration file here. Where is it? Here it is. And in that file, we should remove this Vue TypeScript recommended and TypeScript ESLint entries. So this one and this one. And then save that file, of course. You can also delete the tsconfig.json file, because that is a configuration file for TypeScript. And if we're not using TypeScript, we obviously don't need that. And then, as a next step, we also have to adjust our code files a little bit. In main.js, we should be good, yes. In a router index.js, we need to remove this type assignment here, though, because obviously we can't use types anymore. We also can get rid of that import then, that one import here. And that's it. And in app Vue, we want to remove this lang equals ts part here on the script. And in views, in home.vue, we also want to do that. So get rid of this as well. And that should be it. Let's have a look. Yep, that's looking good. And now we got a JavaScript app. So a couple of adjustments. Let me quickly commit this. Converted project to JavaScript. You also find all the code attached or linked below this video, so you can of course also use that code if you want to get this starting state. Okay, so now we got this all set up, and now let's see what we get out of the box. For this, I'll open up my terminal here, built into this IDE, of course, and we can now simply run Ionic serve here. Again, using that Ionic CLI, but now to bring up a development server which serves this application. So let me hit enter here. And this will now, well, obviously start a development server. It should automatically open up a new tab in your browser. Here it is. And that's our Ionic Vue web application, which with Capacitor can easily be converted to a native mobile app. And that's what we get out of the box here. We got this here, and if we have a look at this home.vue file, we can already see a couple of Ionic components in action here. All these ion dash elements here, these are Ionic components, which are part of the Ionic framework, the Ionic library, which we can use in this project here. We also see that all these components are in the end imported down there in our script tags. We're importing them from Ionic Vue, and they're then defined as local components here in this component, in this Vue component. And that's also important. We have a regular Vue component which we export here. The find component is a function you might not have seen before. I'm not using it in my Vue course, for example. You don't need it. Technically, you can remove it. It can just provide extra understanding to the IDE and to TypeScript, which is why it was there initially, because this project was created with TypeScript. You could remove it and everything would still work. If I save it now, you see I still got this project here. And that's that. That's this first starting page. But of course, we're not here for the first starting page. Instead, we want to build our own Ionic application, and we want to get a feeling for how Vue Ionic works. And therefore, I'm going to clear everything here. I'm going to delete the home Vue file. I'm going to delete the views folder even. And in app Vue, I'm also, well, I can leave the find component here. I will leave app Vue as it is actually. But in the router index.js file, I'm going to remove this route. And of course, remove the import because this home component doesn't exist anymore. And now let's start from scratch, because now obviously this page is empty. So how can we now build an Ionic Vue application? And for that, let's actually start by adding, let's say, a simple list. Yes, lists are always boring. I know no one likes them, but it is great to get started with them, because with a list where we can add and remove items, I can actually show a lot of things. And we're going to spice this up throughout this video by then also adding the camera so that we can take a photo and that we can basically manage data which has images included. But that's the next step. Let's start with the list. And for this, I'll first of all create a new folder named Pages, and I'll add a first page. And let's say we're managing a bunch of memories here. So I'll name this memories page.vue, which is just one possible way of naming this component. And this will be a Vue component. And it will hold the code for one of the pages I want to have in my application, which will render a list of memories in the end. Now here we create a regular single file component with a template and a script tag. And I will also say right away, with Ionic Vue, you can of course use both the Options API for building your components or the Composition API. Both works. And I'll use the Options API here. Maybe if you want it, we can also transform this project to the Composition API in a separate video. But I'll use the Options API because I would guess that more people know how to use that. Okay, so we got this template now, we got this Vue component, and we want to use it as a page which we load with the router. So in our router index.js file here, I will actually import my memories page from going up one level, and then pages memories page.vue, and add a new route. And you add a route just as you know it from Vue router, because we are using Vue router here. So there's nothing special about that. So here I will then simply add a path, let's say /memories, and I'll define a component which should be loaded for this path, and that's my memories page. So this component which I'm importing here. And I'll ensure that all requests to just /, so my domain /nothing, are forwarded to /memories by setting the redirect here. And if we now save that, we get an error because we got an empty template here in the memories page. But this proves that it's trying to load this component at least. Now in here, we generally can now write regular HTML code because it is a regular web application. And that's really something you have to keep in mind. It is a regular web application. You can apply what you know. You could add a header here. You could add a h2 tag where you say the memories page. All of that works. You can do that. And if I now reload and I go to /nothing, I'm forwarded to /memories and I see the memories page, just with some default styling, which is provided here by Ionic basically. We're going to have a look at styling later. So we get the memories page. And of course, we're not here to build just a regular web application with just regular HTML. Instead, we typically want to use these Ionic components to get these nice looking mobile ready components. And for that, we need to import and register the components which we want to use. And we could import and register them as global components, as you know and learned in my course, but also as local components. And generally, registering components locally is a best practice because it ensures that components are in the end only loaded if needed, if you are loading the component that uses the components lazily. So if you would load memories page lazily, which we're not doing at the moment, but which we could do, if we would do that, then all the local components in memories page would only be loaded if they're needed, which of course is better than if they're always loaded. It reduces the initial bundle size. So therefore here, in the memories page component, we import from Ionic Vue, and we now import all the components we want to use here. Obviously, you now probably ask yourselves, which components do we have here? And the answer, of course, can be found on ionicframework.com. If you go to developers again and click on UI components, then you get an overview of all the components the Ionic library comprises. And you get a bunch of components there for alerts, for modals, for lists, for forms, everything which you might want to build. And of course, definitely browse through this list here to get a feeling for which kind of components you have. I can tell you what we will need is, first of all, an Ion page component. And all these Ionic components start with Ion. So we'll need an Ion page component, we'll need an Ion header component, we'll need an Ion title component, and I'm going to tell you why we need them, of course, but we will need those. We'll also need the Ion content component. And these will be 4 essential components which you basically need on every new page which you build. Not on every component which you build, but on every component which you want to load as a page through the router. And I'm going to tell you why in a second. Now, once they are imported, in our component object here, we have to register them as components through the components option, no matter if you're using the options or a composition API. And we do this by picking a key name of our choice, for example, Ion page, and assigning the appropriate component on the right side of the colon. And of course, we can shorten this in modern JavaScript and just write Ion page to register the Ion page component under an Ion page key. So let's do the same for Ion header and Ion title and Ion content. And once we did all of that, we can use these components in this memories page component. And here we can now use them with kebab case. Also with this syntax here, since this code will be compiled ahead of time, but I'm a fan of using kebab case since this works always with Vue, no matter if you load it through a CDN or whatever. And the goal here always is, if you're building a page, so if you're building a component which is loaded through the router, that you wrap the entire template, the entire content which you want to load with the Ion page Ionic element, this component. This is required to ensure that Ionic can load this page with a nice animation and transition between multiple pages, if you would have multiple pages, smoothly. At the moment, of course, we don't have multiple pages, but that's going to change. So always use Ion page around your main page components which you're building with Vue in Ionic. And that's true also if you're using Ionic React or Ionic Angular, as you also learn in my respective Ionic Angular and Ionic React courses, also linked below the video, of course. So we got this Ion page. And then, once we get that, it's important to understand that every page typically consists of 2 main parts. And that's the header, so this bar at the top, which we saw before, which is gone now, but the header basically, and then the main content. And that's why I added Ion header and Ion content. And the title is simply the title of the page in the header. So the visible title, not the metadata title or anything like that, but the title which you can see. So here we're going to add our Ion header now and our Ion content side by side. And in the Ion header, we can also add our Ion title and simply say all memories here as a title. And here between Ion content, I'll say H2. These are my memories, list to be added. Like that. And if we now save this and go back to our application, we see our title here and we see this text here. And actually, I forgot one super important component, which you also always need, and that's the Ion toolbar. You also need to import that and also add this. By the way, the position where you import and add it doesn't matter. You need the Ion toolbar as well, because inside of the Ion header, around your Ion title, you need that Ion toolbar component for proper styling. So make sure you add Ion toolbar, very important component, and now this looks better. So now we got this web application, and yeah, we got our first Ionic page. Obviously, not too exciting yet, but we're getting there step by step. So now that we got this first page here, let's fill it with more life than just this H2 element. And for that, I want to render a list here. And for this, we get the Ion list component and also already the Ion item component, which allows us to render list items. And we then simply import Ion list and Ion item. So we'll simply add them as components. And then here in Ion content, we can add an Ion list. And then here in the Ion list, a Ion item. And if we do that, we could render a couple of names here: Max, Manuel, Julie, George, whatever. If you do that and reload, you see these items here. And now let's also switch away from this web view here. It is a web app, but let's not view it like this. But instead here in Chrome, we can open up the developer tools and then click on this icon here to preview this on a mobile device, so to say. It's still a web application, but we see how it will look like on a mobile device. And here, let's say we want to preview it on an iPhone X, or maybe, well, let's actually go with the Pixel 2. And now we got the look we will probably have if we would build this as a mobile app and run it on a Pixel 2, though the final look can always deviate a bit. You should always test it on a real device, and we're also going to do this later. So we got this now. I got this dummy list rendered, of course with hard-coded data though, but it is a first step. Before we take any other next step, let's talk about the styling here. Now, we got some default styles, like these separators between the list items, a certain font, but of course it's also pretty white at the moment, right? And we can fine-tune the entire look here with our theme folder and the variable CSS file here. Though I also want to say that, of course, you always have to keep in mind that this is a regular web app which you're building. So you can always add in your own styling. You can add the style section here in your single file component and start styling these elements. You can even target these elements. So you can even target the Ion title like this and then assign a background color of red, for example. You can do that. Doesn't look pretty here, but you can do that. Now, for a general theming and for tweaking these out-of-the-box styles which you get, we have this variables CSS file here. And in there, a feature is being used which is built into modern CSS and modern web development, so to say, the CSS variables feature. This is not Sass or anything like that. Instead, here we get a bunch of CSS variables which are used under the hood by the Ionic components. And here we can tweak our different colors and also which colors should be used where. So as you can see, for example, we got some basic colors here, quite a lot. We also got support for dark mode here, though I will actually remove that here. I will remove that dark mode part here. Not entirely though. Let's grab these color steps here, the Ion color step variables, and let's cut them here and actually add them here in this first block. So in this first block for this root selector, and then thereafter I'm going to remove everything below that root selector because I want to keep it simple here. So we already got a bunch of colors though, that's what I want to say. And nonetheless, we don't see these colors being used anywhere. because it just happens to be the case that out of the box, a toolbar, for example, doesn't use any of these colors, or not one of the colors. We can see it uses a white color, to be precise. But that's something you can change. You can add a new file here in the theme folder, which I'll name core CSS. The name is entirely up to you though. And I will import this in main.js right below this theme variables CSS import. Here I'll import theme core CSS so that whatever I write in that file will be picked up. And here I'll now target every Ion toolbar element. So this will be applied as a global style, not scoped to any component. And in there we can set another special variable. So using these CSS variables is an important thing in Ionic. And you can always see which Ionic variables or which CSS variables can be tweaked where. If you look for a specific element, like the Ion toolbar, and then you learn how to use it. And then at the bottom, you have a list of CSS properties which you can override. And for example here, we can set the background of the toolbar by setting the -- background CSS variable inside of the Ion toolbar selector. So here, -- background. And here we can now set this to a certain color. And of course, I want to use one of the colors I defined here for my theme. Let's say the primary color. And for that, we can use the var function in CSS and then use some other CSS variable which has been defined before. In this case, the Ion color primary variable. I'm using it here as a value for this other variable, which then under the hood will be picked up by Ionic to give that toolbar a background color. And if we do all of that, we see now it's blue. Now to ensure that the text is well readable, we also want to set the -- color variable inside of Ion toolbar, because that allows us to set the text color. And I'll set this to Ion color primary - contrast, which in variables CSS defines a contrast color for this primary color. Max from the future here. I have to step in here real quick. You can set the color of the toolbar items like this, and this will work on Android, but on iOS you might not be seeing the toolbar buttons and so on. So instead of setting -- color in the Ion toolbar selector for that, you can also set a different variable. In the variables CSS file in this root selector here, there you can also set the Ion toolbar color variable to this primary contrast color. And by doing that, the toolbar items, all the buttons in the toolbar and so on, should have the appropriate contrast color not just on Android, which should work with this setting alone as well, but also on iOS. That's just a little note. And if we do that and go back here, this looks better. Now maybe you don't want to go with these default colors though. Then, of course, you can tweak these variables in the variables CSS files and use different colors for the primary color, the secondary color, and so on. And there are different components in the Ionic library which will use these colors. Some if you tell them to, and some out of the box. Now, if you want to adjust all these colors in one go and get a nice tool for tweaking and previewing the colors you want to pick, you can go back to the Ionic docs here. To developers, let's go to installation, and then here to the theming part. And there you'll find a color generator, which is awesome. There you get a preview of your colors, and you can tweak these colors, and then you can export them as CSS code. So for example, here I could pick like a dark purple color here for my primary color. Secondary, let's say, is then a lighter purple. And tertiary, I'll stick to this darker bluish purple here. And actually for secondary, let's maybe go with that color. Or let's actually take a orange color as a contrast. That might be good too. So these are the colors I'll pick. You can tweak them all. You can tweak the success colors. And then you can just click copy down there. And you get these variables. You can now go to your root part here and actually replace all these colors. You could almost replace the entire root selector, but I want to keep these color steps here, which are for text colors. So I'll just repeat the other colors, just replace the other colors, and get rid of this unnecessary nested root selector here. Okay, and if I now save that with my new colors, here we go. Got this purple color. And that's how you can tweak this. So it's this combination of using all these CSS variables to tweak individual components and setting these core variables, these colors, maybe with help of the color generator, to give your application the look you want. And in addition to that, always keep in mind that you can write your own styles as well. So you're not limited to just the built-in variables and so on. You can always override everything and tweak everything with your own custom CSS styling. And you can learn way more about styling and theming and how you could add brand new colors with your own names here in the theming docs, of course. There you can also explore how to add dark mode, for example. But I'm happy with this look here, and therefore as a next step, I want to make sure that we can tap these list items so that we're taken to a second page, so that we then also can see these beautiful animations in action. So let's add a second page. And here I'll have my memory details.vue file. And of course, at the moment, these aren't really memories. These are names, I'm aware of that. But we're going to change this to be memories soon. Actually, let me go there to the memories page and give these more memory-like names. Like a trip into the mountains, surfing, the sea side, whatever, good eating, and let's get rid of the third one. So now this is more memory-like. And now I get the memory details component. Again, it's a regular Vue component, so we add our script and our template here. And as I mentioned before, we'll need this core skeleton of having Ion page, Ion toolbar, and Ion header, Ion content, and typically also the Ion title. And therefore, of course, we want to again import, like on the memories page, all these components here from Ionic Vue. However, if we do that, we basically repeat ourselves, which is not horrible here, but which we typically want to avoid. The better solution in the Vue world would be to build another component and then use composition to combine these different components to avoid reusage. And therefore, we can add a components folder here in the source folder, and in there maybe add another folder which we name base, whatever, for some base components. And in there, in this base folder, in the components folder, I'll add a base layout.vue file, which should hold a base layout component. And here I'll again use template and script. And now I'll take the imports from the memories page component and add them here in base layout. However, not Ion list and Ion item, just page, header, toolbar, title, and content. And I'll of course register them as components, so I'll copy that as well, but get rid of Ion item and Ion list, of course. And then here in this template, I will basically copy my skeleton from memories page, so this entire Ion page block with Ion header and everything inside of it, and paste it in here, but actually replace the concrete content, so in this case this list here, with a slot. That's how we then later can use composition to use this here as a wrapper component and then put any content in there which we want to. That's how we can do that. And we could use multiple slots if we had multiple dynamic pieces. So here I of course also want to make the title dynamic, and we could use another slot for that, a name slot, but I will just use interpolation here and name this page title. And expect a prop here. So in my component definition, I'll add props. And then either use the longer syntax, where you describe in detail how a prop should look like, or just have an array of props and define the page title here. so that we get this as a prop. And then we can use the base layout component here in memories page, or since we're going to use it in a lot of different components in the app and basically on every page, we even register it as a global component. Because importing this early won't hurt, because we're going to use the base layout component on every page anyways. So therefore here we can import base layout from /components base layout.vue, and then simply use our app here, call the component method on it, and register the base layout component under a base layout tag like this. And now we can use this in any Vue component. So here in memories page, we can now replace ion page and ion content here with base layout like this. And of course also use the closing tag here and set the page title to all memories in this case. If we now save that, I have an error, yes, that I'm importing a bunch of things which I don't need here anymore. So let's remove ion page header, toolbar, title, and content imports from the memories page. Also remove the component registrations, because the actual Ionic components we're actively using in this template here in the memories page now is ion list and ion item because of our outsourced base layout. And now we can use this base layout in memory detail as well, like this, and just set a different page title like the details. Though of course maybe this should be dynamic later. For the moment I'll hard code it. And then here we can have a h2 tag where we say the details page for the moment. If I now save that and reload, this works again. And now we want to reach this memory details page, of course. And how would that work? Well, it's a new page and I want to be able to go there with routing. Therefore, we want to go to our router index.js file and then add a new route here with a path of, let's say, /memories/id as a dynamic segment, and then load this component. And here we can actually also use lazy loading because we might not always visit this page. And that's very easy to do in Vue. We just add an inline function here and dynamically import from the pages folder the memory details.vue component. And then this code for this component will only be downloaded if we really need it. Now, in order to go there, we now also need a link. And the link, of course, should be the item here, right? The different items we have, if we click them, I want to be taken to the details page for that item. So therefore, on the memories page where we have that list, every item should be clickable. And that's something you can easily do in Ionic. Now, to go to the details page when clicking on this ion item, we can simply add a router link on it, and then simply point at memories 1, for example. To go to the memory with ID 1, of course, 1 or the ID 1 is just made up here. If we do that and reload, I can click on a trip into the mountains and I'm taken to the details page. And we can use the browser back button for now to go back. And that's how easy we can navigate here. Now, of course, we might want to have a back button here in the toolbar, since that would be our mobile app in the end, and you don't always have another back button. On Android, you might have that. On iOS, you don't. And therefore, to add a back button, we can go to the base layout, where we have our header and toolbar. And inside of the toolbar, we can use another Ionic component related to navigation. And that's the ion back button, which we should import and then register as a local component in the base layout. And then here, we can add ion back button here in the toolbar. And if we now go back, reload, and go to a trip into the mountains, we see it here. Now, obviously, it's placed awfully. It works, but it's not looking pretty, because Ionic doesn't know where to place it. In this ion toolbar, we now get two elements, the back button and the title. With one element, everything was fine. But you can think of ion toolbar as an Ionic component, because in the end it is, which also has a slot. And all the content between the opening and closing tags of Ion toolbar is then placed in that slot. Now for one element this was no problem, but now both the back button and the title are placed in this one slot in the middle. And well, they simply split the content or the available space. Therefore, looks like Ion back button takes the entire line, and therefore the details moves to a new line and looks ugly. Now we can tell Ionic where to place something by adding the slot attribute to certain elements in certain places, for example to the back button inside of a toolbar. We can set this slot here to start. However, we shouldn't do this on the back button actually, but instead we should use another component, the Ion buttons component. Ion buttons, not button, but buttons. Also register it. And then wrap your back button with Ion buttons. And add the slot start on Ion buttons. Ion buttons is a specific component which should be used inside of the toolbar, inside of a header, so that Ionic can position all the buttons you might have there, because obviously you can have more buttons in the toolbar than just the back button, so that Ionic can place these buttons in a nice way. And now if we save that with Ion buttons with a slot start and the back button inside of the Ion buttons, if we now go back, reload, and go to a trip into the mountains, now this looks better. And you also see the beautiful animation we get out of the box because we're using Ionic, under the hood the Ionic Vue router, and the Ion page components. Now you'll also notice that if I reload on the details page, I don't have the back button. The reason for that is that if we reload, all the previous application state is lost, and therefore Ionic doesn't know if we can go back and where this back page would be. It does know it if we come from another page without reloading in between, because it then memorizes that we came from there, but if we reload on the details page, that information doesn't exist. So to make sure that we still get the back button there, we can add a default reference here. So a default link basically which will be used. And since I have my base layout component here, which can be used on different pages, this default ref should be dynamic and should maybe point at a prop which I'll name page default backlink, whatever name you want to use. I'll go with page default backlink and add this as a prop, which I expect here. And now we can go to the memories page where we use the base layout, to the memory detail page where we use the base layout and set the page default backlink to /memories. Because from the memories details page, which is /memories/someid, we want to go back to just /memories. If I now save that and I reload, you see the back button is there after reloading because we set the default link, and I can click it to be taken back to that page, even though we reloaded. And that's the basics of navigation in action here. Now, with that, we got our list, we can navigate back and forth, and we added some styling. Let's now use at least a little bit more dynamic data here, instead of having the hard-coded Ion items here. So let's now make this a little bit more dynamic. And for that, in the memories page component, I will add my data option, because I said I'll use the options API, and in here I'll have my memories, simply an array of items. And now it'll still be some dummy data, but I at least have a little bit more complex dummy data and will render the list here dynamically. So every memory, let's say, has an ID, M1 for example, and has a title, which can be the nice titles I came up with up here. So simply have these titles here as strings. And then let's say every memory also has a short description text. It was a really nice trip. Something like that. Now I'll also replicate this to have more memories. And then here I set my title to surfing the seaside, of course, because that was the second title I used here. And last but not least, let's add this third dummy memory here, good eating, and adjust the descriptions. Feeling the cool breeze, something like that, and here, really tasty. Now, obviously, this is just some dummy data. We can, of course, also add some images, some links to images, which should be shown here. So for that, I'll add an image field here, and now we need to find some images. So here I just did a quick image search for images which I can use for free here, and I'll just grab a bunch of such links here. I'll fast forward through that. I'll skip that because you can simply pick some images of your choice, some links to images of your choice here, and fill that into your dummy data. So be right back. And here I have it. I added image links to all 3 items. And now we want to output them dynamically and, of course, also render these images. So therefore, first of all, I'll remove 2 Ion items here and remove the hard-coded text and the hard-coded link. And we're going to use a directive, which we know from Vue, the v-for directive, for looping through some data and rendering a component multiple times. So here we'll go through all our memories. So memory in memories is the code we have here to go through all these memories. And then the router link, for example, is set dynamically to a string where we go to memories / and then here I'll inject memory.id so that we go to that page. And here I also, of course, inside of the Ion item, want to have my title, which is now output dynamically with interpolation here. That's memory.title. And if we use v-for, we also should set the key here, bind the key, in this case dynamically to memory.id, so that every item has a unique ID, a unique key. And now we get the same text as before, but output dynamically. Obviously, it would now be nice to also have an image. And for that, we can use another component, which we can import from Ionic Vue, and that's the Ion image component. We could also use the regular image tag, but the Ion image also has some extra features. It also is easier to style and easier to fit into an Ion item. That's a plus. And in addition, it's loaded lazily. So it's only loaded if it needs to be displayed. And if it's outside of the visible screen, it would not be loaded, for example. That's why I'll use Ion image instead of the regular image. We do then use it just like the regular image though in the end. So we add Ion image like this, and then set the source here dynamically to memory.image, because that is our image link, right? And set the alt text maybe to memory.title. And if we do that, we now got an image as well. Obviously, however, not looking that great, because it doesn't have the finished styling out of the box. It's just a bit easier to combine with certain other Ionic elements. But here I'll use the Ion thumbnail image to add an image which looks good, because we can simply wrap an image, even a normal image actually, with the Ion thumbnail inside of an Ion item, use the right slot again to tell Ionic where inside of the item to position it, and it will look good. So let's add Ion thumbnail, and let's also already add Ion label, because we'll need that as well, and register both Ion thumbnail as well as Ion label as components in the memories page, and then wrap the Ion image with Ion thumbnail, like this, and wrap the text with Ion label. This is technically not required. We could also use a span, but this again ensures that everything looks perfect and works perfectly together. Now on Ion thumbnail, we again add this slot instruction, which certain Ionic components take in certain places. In this case, to tell Ionic where to place this thumbnail inside of this item. And I'll set slot to start to tell Ionic that it should be in a specific spot at the start, so on the left of the Ionic item. And if we now save that and go back, this looks much better, right? Doesn't this look beautiful? We now got our items here. We can of course still click them, and please note that in the URL, different IDs are loaded. So now as a next step, of course, let's make sure that we also display the real information for the specific memory on the memory details page. And for that, of course, we need to find out which ID this page was loaded with, and then we need to grab the data for that. And for this, of course, we also should manage our memories not just here in memories page, but also in a more global place where all components have access to. That could be our app component, our root component. For example, with provide and inject, we can make data accessible in all components. We could also build our own state management solution, or we use Vuex. So for that, I'll stop this development server here and npm install --save Vuex at next at the moment, because I'm recording this at a point of time where the latest version of Vuex is not officially out yet. It's stable and everything, but yeah. So let's install Vuex here. And Vuex, in case you don't know, is Vue's official state management solution for managing application-wide state. I also teach that in great detail in my Vue course. So if you want to learn all about that, my course is the place to go. Let's wait for this to be installed. And once it is installed here, I will restart Ionic Serve to bring up that development server again and add a new store folder here next to my pages and components folder and so on, in which I want to set up my Vuex store. Now, there are different ways of defining a Vuex store. Depending on the complexity and so on, you can use modules to split it into multiple pieces. Here, I'll set up a very simple store. I'll just add an index.js file in the store folder, and then import from Vuex and import the create store function here. And then we create a store by calling create store. And I will then export that store as a default and go to main.js. And there, below importing my router, actually now that I see it, let me also import my component up there to have all the component imports in one place. This is optional, but I still want to do it. But now below that, below my router, I'll import my store from /store. We could say /index, but it will automatically import from the index.js file if you have such a file in a folder. And now we just need to make Vue aware of this store, which we do by going to our create app call here, and we chain another use call to also use our store in this created Vue app. And now this store is available. Now, to create store, we pass an object where we configure this Vuex store. And there we definitely need a state function, which returns our state data. And my state data is actually the data I had in the data option on the memories page before. So I'll grab this memories key here, cut it from the memories page, and add it here in my Vuex state. Now I also will, of course, add some getters so that we can get that data. And I'll just name my getter memories. We get access to the state here. And I'll keep it simple and I'll just return state memories. So I'll just return these memories. We can also add mutations and actions, but for the moment we don't need these. So now back on the memories page, we of course want to utilize this store. And we typically do that by adding a computed property with the computed option here in this case, since I'm using the options API. And here I'll name this memories as well and return this $store. This is a globally available property because we added Vuex and we're using Vuex on our app. And then there I access .getters.memories. And this gives me access to the memories getter, which I defined a second ago. And now we again have access to the memories here, but they're now managed in Vuex. If I save and reload though, it still works as before. But since I'm managing my data in Vuex now, or with Vuex now, we can also take advantage of it here in the memory details. There, I now want to get the memory for the specific ID that was loaded. For that, we first of all need to find out which ID was used for visiting this memory details page, because of course we have different IDs. Now we can get that ID and store that ID by adding some data and having our memory ID here, which initially is null. And then we can add a watcher and actually watch $route. $route is a globally available property which exists because we're using the Vue router. Now this is a method actually. Watchers are methods in Vue. And this method will be triggered whenever our route changes. And it does change if the ID changes, for example. We then get our current route object here, and we can, for example, extract our ID parameter from there. So here we can then set this memory ID equal to current route.params. That's where you access the route parameters, so the parameters encoded in the URL, .id. .id here, because in my router configuration, I named this segment ID. If you use a different name here, you also need to use a different name here. So now with that, we get our memory ID. And now we can use a computed property here to get a specific memory for that ID. And for that, we need to go back to the store and add another getter, which we could name memory. And here we get our state like in all getters, but here I actually return a function so that this getter actually returns a function to the place where we access it. And this function takes the memory ID as a parameter and then simply returns, so this function which is returned returns state memories find. And now I'm searching for a memory where the ID is equal to the memory ID I'm getting as a parameter in this return function. And that allows me to call this function from inside my Vue components to get a specific memory from that list of memories which I have here. Obviously, this will return undefined if we don't find a memory for this ID. In the memory detail page, we can now add a computed property, memory, or loaded memory, whatever you want to call it. And here I'll return this store getters memory, but now I don't just point at it as I did it with my memories getter in the memories page, but I'll execute it. Because memory is now a function. It's a function, the function which we return in this getter, which we need to execute to find a specific memory. And here I'll pass in my memory ID. And this will give me that memory which we loaded. Now, obviously, we might load a page for a memory which doesn't exist. That's why we should have a fallback for that. We could, for example, say we load this h2 tag if not loaded memory. If that is undefined or nullish, then we say could not find a memory for the given ID. But otherwise, we say loaded it for the moment, just to see whether it works, with velse in this case. And we also want to bind the page title dynamically now to use the actual memory title. So here we can access the loaded memory.title. If we now save that and we go to a memory, we get an error. Cannot read property title of undefined. The reason for that is that initially we have no memory yet. We start with a memory ID of null, so therefore there is a time span where we don't have a loaded memory yet because we don't have an ID yet. And that's why accessing this title doesn't work. So we can simply check whether loaded memory is truthy and only set the title if it is, and otherwise say loading. Like this. And if we now do that, and I now click here, this looks better, at least to a certain degree, but it never loads the memory which we want. It always says loading and that it could not find a memory for the given ID. So why is that happening? Simply because this watcher isn't fired when we initially load the page. It would fire if the route would change whilst we're on the page. If we had a button that changes the ID in the URL whilst we're on the page, for example, but not if we initially visit the page. But the good thing is, when we initially visit the page, we can already read the data from the URL. And we can set our data here, this memory ID, which we initially set as a first value, to this route params.id therefore. And then only have that watcher as a backup if the ID should change whilst we're on the page. If you can rule out that this ever happens, and indeed in this application it shouldn't happen, we can of course also remove this watcher. Now with that, if we now reload, you see a trip into the mountains is loaded here, and if I reload the page, we also load that. So that's now working. When I navigate away, you see the data here is lost, but to my knowledge, this is just a temporary bug with the Vue router, where this watcher fires when we leave the route. And since we don't need it anyways, I'll comment it out, this watcher. And then I always have this proper behavior here. So that's working. Now we have our dynamic data being used, loaded on both the list page as well as the details page. Now let's refactor this a little bit before we then make sure that we also can add our own memories, which also then will happen with help of the device camera. So let's refactor this a little bit. At the moment, we have only two page components, and the memories page component, for example, holds the entire list rendering logic. It is a better practice to split this up and to have small reusable components, just as your functions should be focused on one thing and should be small. Have a look at my clean code course to learn more about that. So in components, we can therefore add a memories folder, for example, and in there add a memories list.vue component, and also already a memory list item.vue component. Now let's start with the memories list though. I have my template and my script in there, and my goal is to take that entire ion list and cut it from memories page and instead render it here in the template of memories list. However, the ion item actually will not be rendered here. I'll cut that. Instead, that will be rendered in the memory list item. So here we also need a template where we render the ion item. And with that, we can have these smaller, easier to maintain components, which are each focused on one thing. For example, here, the memory list item component is focused on, well, rendering a memory list item. So we get the ion item here. And therefore, here in the script tags of this memory list item component, we need to import the Ionic components which we are using here. In this case, the ion item, the ion thumbnail, the ion image, and the ion label. Not loading, but label. And then register these components as components here in this Vue component. Like this. And now we can use them all here. Now, of course, in the memory list item component, we rely on a bunch of data. We need our memories to be precise so that we can loop through them. And therefore, I'll add a prop which I expect here. And that's the memories prop here. We could also use the more expressive props syntax, but I'll use the short one here to save some time. So we have memories as a prop. In memories list, we now use the ion list. So we want to import that. Import ion list from Ionic Vue. And register that as a component here. And of course here, we also need the data which should be rendered in that list. We need our memory list item, and we need the memories which we then use to create these memory list items. And therefore here, I expect to get some props as well. I expect to get my memories. And actually, this is the actual place where we should get our memories, not the memory list item. There, we should actually get a single memory, because that looping logic with v4 should not be in the memory list item component. That's just one item after all. It should be in the memories list component. So let's grab this looping logic and that key here and just refer to memory all the time, which is the new prop I set up there. And in the memories list component, let's import the memory list item component from that memory list item.vue file and register it as a component, of course, here in the components key. And inside of ion list, we then render the memory list item, and we put our v4 directive onto the memory list item and add our key here as well. And now we also want to bind the memory prop here, because that is the prop the memory list item component expects. So we add this and bind this to memory. So to the memory variable we get from this loop here. To this variable we bind this prop. And now we can use the memories list component in the memories page component. So here we can remove all these imports actually. We're using none of them anymore. And instead just import the memories list component from components, memories, memories list.vue, register this as the only component here, and then in the base layout, simply output memories list and pass in the memories prop, which we do expect here in the memories list component, pass in the memories prop and bind it to the computed memories property we got here. So that we get the memories here in the page component. We could get them in the list component as well, but it's here in the page component where I want to do all that data fetching. And then we forward the memories to the memories list, which is responsible for rendering a list, which then renders the memory list items, which are responsible for rendering the concrete items. And if we saved it all, we should have the same output as before, except that I got this error, but that's because I do import ion label in the memory list item component, but I'm not defining it as a component, which we of course should do. And now I got a duplicate key for ion item. Yes, this doesn't need to be imported twice or defined twice. Once is enough. And now this works. So now this is working. Now let's work on the details page. And let's make sure that we dare also see more than just this dummy text. And for this here in memory details, we of course want to render more than just this h2 tag here. And therefore I'll already create a new component here in the components folder, in the memories folder, in this subfolder. And here I'll add a new component and I'll name it memory overview. .vue, that's my file name. Got my template in there and my script tags. And in here, I in the end wanna, let's say, render an image, and then below that the title, and below that the description. Hence, I will import a couple of components from Ionic Vue. And we can import the ion image again. We could also use the regular image, because lazy loading won't really play a role here. This image will always be visible, but I'll stick to ion image here. And that's it for now, actually. Let's now register this as a component. And then in here, output ion image, and set the source to something, and set alt to something, like this. And below that, maybe a h2 tag, where we want to output the title, and below that a h3 tag where we have the description, or a paragraph tag is maybe better. And now of course the data is missing. And I want to get that through props, because this is not a page component which is loaded through the router. And even though we still could use the router to get the ID here and then reach out to Vuex, I want to use the memory details page component here to fetch all the data and then just pass it on to my memory overview component here. And as a side note, this of course should be called memory details page to be in line with memories page. That's a tiny thing, which also needs to be adjusted in the router index.js file now, here, but it is something which I want to adjust. But that wasn't the main thing. Instead, here in memory overview, I now expect to get my data as props. And here I expect to get a title, I expect to get an image, and I expect to get a description. We could also just expect one object which has all these fields as properties. But to mix it up, I'll expect the individual props, the individual property values as separate props. And then here we can bind source of ion image to image, bind alt to title, and also output title here with interpolation, and output the description here with interpolation as well. And in the memory detail page component, we can now import memory overview. So this component we just worked on from components, memories, memory overview.vue, and then simply register this as a component. So add the component's key here and register memory overview. And then here, instead of a h2 tag, I will render memory overview in the VElse case, so if we found a memory, and then simply set title to loaded memory.title. Set image to loaded memory.image. And set description to loaded memory.description. If we now save that, and I fix my error, which I introduced, if we save that, and I go to this page, we now have this, which looks better, I would say. Now, of course, the text there, that's not looking that great though. Now, to style this in a nicer way, this text here, we can use a couple of utility classes Ionic ships with. If you check out the Ionic docs here, the theming docs, or here under layout, you do see that they also offer a grid, which you could use, which we're not using here, but you do have a grid, which is really powerful, but that you also get a bunch of CSS utilities, which are small utility classes, which, for example, can help with text alignment. And that's what I want here. To the title, I'll add a class of ion text center to center this text, and I'll do the same here for my description, just like that. If I now save this, this looks much better. Obviously, it's still a simple component, but we're getting there step by step. And now we get this details page as well. Now I would say it's time that we can add our own memories as well, before we then make sure that we can also add our own memories with our own images, which we took ourselves. So let's now work on being able to add our own memory. And for that, we first of all need a new page where we can have that form for adding a new memory. So I'll add it, name it the add memory page here in the pages folder. And that should not be a folder, but a file. So add memory page.vue is the file name. In there, as always, we got a template and a script. And we want to load it through the router. There, I'll register a new path, therefore, and that could be memories/add. And then we have a dynamically loaded component where we import from the pages folder the add memory page.vue file. Side note, because we're using the latest Vue router, we can have /memories/add after memories/dynamic ID, and it will still find that because behind the scenes it reorders these routes by and matches them in an intelligent way, basically. In the past, with older versions, we would have to move that route in front of memories ID, because otherwise add would have been treated as an ID. But now the latest Vue router is able to differentiate, and if we visit /memories/add, it will load this route. Might sound like something which should be obvious, but in the past this didn't work, now it does. That's just a side note. Now this is registered, and now we can work on this page. Of course, I want to use my base layout here, because we need ion page, the toolbar, and everything. And I will add a title here, which is, or page title actually, which is, which could be create or add a memory, like this. And I will have a default, what was my name? Page default backlink. My page default backlink, which here is /memories. So that's my base layout thus far. Now I also need some content, and for the moment I'll just say add a memory here, like this. And now we need a way of getting there. And there are different ways of doing that, of course, different ways of achieving that. But I want to have a plus button here in the toolbar, which takes me to that page. And therefore, here on my memories page, which is that list of memory, or which holds that list of memories, I want to have that plus button in my toolbar. The problem is that the toolbar is burrowed here in my base layout. The solution could be a slot. Here, I'll add another set of ion buttons, like this. And then in there have a slot which now has a name, so a named slot. And I'll give this slot a name of actions end, because I'll set the slot here to end. So these will be the buttons positioned on the right side, or it depends on the platform on which this runs, but on the end of the toolbar, wherever that is. But on the end of the toolbar, I'll have some buttons, and they are set here by passing in a slot which has this name. Now, because I have this slot here in the base layout, I can go to my memories page and utilize this slot. We already do pass the memories list to the default slot. Now we can also target that named slot. For that, here we need to add another template tag. That's how we need to do that in Vue. And we use the vslot directive then and target our slot with a name of actions end, like this. And then between these template tags, we have the content which will go into that slot of this other component. And in this case, this will be a button with an icon. Now, both are components which are provided by Ionic, so I'll import them from Ionic Vue, and I'll import the ion button, and I'll import the ion icon. And to set an icon, I'll take advantage of another package which is installed automatically, which is a dependency of Ionic, and that's the Ionicons package. And there, from /icons, we can import various icons which we can use. Nicely looking SVG icons. And here I'll import the add icon. Now, to find out which icons exist, you can visit ionicons.com, and here you find a list of all the icons, and you can always click on an icon then, and you'll get the code on how you could include it, and you'll get the name of the icon as well. Now, for Vue, including works a little bit differently. There we have to import the icon by its name, which we want to use. And then we have to add the data property, or return it in the setup method if we're using the composition API, and basically return our icon as data. So here I'll return add, which I imported, as data in this component. And then we can use it later. Now we can use all of that between my template tags here to add an ion button. Whoops, ion button. Which has the ion icon inside of it. And I'll give this ion icon a slot of icon only, because it's a button which only has that icon. And if we use that slot, the icon will be positioned correctly inside of that button. And then here, I set the icon to a dynamic value, so I'm binding it, and I'll bind it to add. So to that icon, which I import here and which I return in my data. And that's why I am returning it here, so that I can seamlessly use it here in my template. I, of course, also need to register ion button and ion icon here as components in the memories page. And then this works. If I reload now, you see the plus button here, the plus icon. Now, of course, pressing it doesn't do anything yet. And what it should do is that we should go to our details page, to our add page here, to memories/add. And that's easy to do. On our button, we can add the router link attribute and point at /memories/add. And if we do this and reload, now this button takes us to this add page. Simple like that. And if I reload on the add page, we also have that back button, and we can go back because of that page default backlink, which I set here. So that's great. We now got this page. We got a button in the toolbar. Now let's fill this with some life. Let's add a form here. Let's add a form where we can add a title, a description, and for the moment, an image link. So therefore here, I will render a form, and in Ionic, you often do that by creating an ion list with ion items. Not items which are rendered dynamically with v4, but instead hard-coded items. But you get a nice look by doing that. You are totally free to set up that list and create that list however you want though. You must never forget that it's all just a web app with HTML, CSS, and so on. You don't even have to use these Ionic components if you don't want that look. So you can write any code you want here. I, however, will actually import from Ionic Vue, and I will use ion list and ion item here, and I will also use ion label and ion input. And ion input is a component which will help us with fetching user input. I will also import ion text area, which you might be guessing it is basically a text area input. Now let's register all of that here. So ion list, ion item, ion label, ion input, and ion text area. Let's register all of that as local components. And then here in base layout, we can render our ion list and then our different items. And now here I want to have a label for my first input where I say title, so the title of the memory, and then below that a ion input, which will be for the actual user input. Now, just like on a regular HTML input, you can set the type here, for example, to email if you needed that. Here, I'll just use text because I want to get some text. We can add required to require this and add this basic built-in validation which the browser offers, and so on. We can treat this like a regular HTML input in the end. On the ion label, I'll add a position and set this to floating. And that's one of the special props we can set on ion label if we have a look at it, in conjunction with ion input. Here, it's this position. And this defines on how the label will be rendered related to the input. So if we now repeat that and we add another item here for the image URL, the type here could indeed be URL, and we add another item for the description, and here I use ion text area, and maybe add rows equals 5. Then if I save that all, and I go back to this page and reload, we see this form here. And by setting the proper types here, by the way, if we would run this on a mobile phone, the proper keyboards would be displayed. So if you had type email, for example, that would be a soft keyboard on the mobile device, which makes it easy to reach that @ symbol. That's just a side note. So now we got this. We also, of course, need a button to submit this. And I also want to have some padding around the form, actually. And in general, this is not really a valid form yet. For that, we should wrap it with a form, of course, with a regular form element, as we know it from HTML. And then also add another ion item, maybe, which holds a button to submit the form. So for this, we can import ion button here. And of course, register this button as a local component. For something like a button, you could also argue whether you want to make it a global component because you're going to use it a lot. But here I'll stick to a local component because indeed we are loading the add memory page lazily. So indeed we do benefit from loading it locally, this ion button component. It's then only loaded if it's needed. So it makes sense. And in ion item, we can now add the ion button here and say save on the button, for example. And now we got this button here. It looks a bit sad, to be honest. I'll fix that soon. One thing I want to fix right away, however, is on the form. we can add a class with a utility class, another Ionic utility class it ships with, the ion padding class, to add some padding around the form, like this. And now for the button, I think it will look better actually if we don't wrap it in an item, but instead we move it out of the form, and then we can configure this button, of course. We can, for example, give it an expand prop. Again, you find all these supported props in the official docs, and set this to full to have this button here, to have this look. You can also change if it's a filled button or not by adding the fill property and, for example, setting this to outline. And if I now reload, it's an outlined button. And if it wouldn't be set to full here, but to block, it would also have borders on all four, borders. But I'm happy with the default, so with that filled button, and hence I'll go with that. So now we got a button which will submit the form if we press it. We get these different fields, and you see the floating labels. Now let's make sure that when we do press the button, we do indeed submit the form and add a new memory. Now for that, to handle this submission, I'll first of all grab this entire form here, cut it, and outsource it into a new component. Create memory form.vue could be a great name for this component. Put it in there, and then add the script tags here. And this is not required. It's just considered a good practice to split your application into smaller components. And then we can take these imports here, cut the imports of all these Ionic components from add memory page, and add them here in the create memory form component, and register them as local components in that component therefore. And then just use the create memory form component here, create memory form, inside of that add memory page. So here I'll import this component which we just created, of course register it locally, and then simply render that. And that keeps this page component relatively lean, which is my goal here. With that, I got a typo here, and if I fix that, this loads again. Now for the form submission and for adding a new memory. Here in the add memory page, that's always where I want to do my data fetching and my actual work, you could say. Here, I want to handle the form submission. And as a side note, for the moment, I'll not implement validation and showing an error message. You can do that, but it will just be regular Vue code. Of course, the majority of all of that here is regular Vue code, you could argue. But still, it's a huge video. Let's not make it too long. I will focus on the form submission. And therefore, I'll add a method here in my add memory page component. And I'll name it save memory. And here, I expect to get my memory data, so the title, description, and the image URL. And I, in the end, want to store that in my Vuex store. For that, we need to go there in the Vuex store and add a mutation and an action, because that is how you do change data in Vuex. Hence, here we add mutations and actions. And the mutation which I'll have here is the add memory mutation. And I get access to the state here, of course, because the mutation needs to mutate the state. And I get access to my memory data here as a payload. And then the goal is simple. I'll create a new memory here on the fly. Let's create an object. Let's give it an ID. And here I'll generate a pseudo unique ID by taking the current timestamp and converting it to a string. It's not perfect. Theoretically, you could have two memories created at the exact same millisecond, but that's unlikely to happen here, so it's a good enough dummy ID. And then I'll set the title to memory data title, the image to memory data image URL, let's say, and the description to memory data description. And then we can reach out to state memories and maybe unshift it to add it at the beginning as a first memory and add this new memory here in that array. And I'll then add an action, which is also called add memory, which gets this context, which actions always do, and which also gets the memory data. And it's a simple action. It would be the place where you now, for example, reach out to a backend server and store it there. But we're not having this functionality here in this application. So here, all I'm going to do is I'm going to commit my add memory mutation, this mutation we just worked on, and forward the memory data. So therefore, it's kind of redundant. But again, you would be doing asynchronous work or any other kind of work you might want to do in addition to saving that state here in this action if you had other work. So therefore, now we want to dispatch add memory in the add memory page component when save memory is triggered. And we do this by reaching out to this store, dispatch, and then dispatch add memory and forward our memory data here. So again, a very simple save memory method, which in the end just dispatches this basic action. Now it should be dispatched when this form is submitted, and therefore we can emit a custom event in create memory form. So let's go to create memory form, and let's add the emits key to make everyone aware of the event we're emitting. This is technically not required, but recommended, as you learn in my course. And here I will emit an event which could be named save memory, anything like that. That could be our event name. And in the add memory page, we can therefore listen to save memory and trigger the save memory method when that event is emitted. So point at the save memory method here. And in the create memory component, we now have to emit this. So here I also add a method. Submit form could be the method name. And in here, I now want to collect all the data the user entered, pack it all into one object, this memory data, which I send along with my event, and then emit that event. So here I want to, in the end, emit. We could also do extra validation. As I said, I'm not going to do it here. Instead, I emit my save memory event, and I got my memory data package, which I want to pack here. Now for that, we need to get access to the values entered here, and we could use refs for this or two-way binding, and I will go with two-way binding here. So I'll add my data method here and manage some data for this component. And that would be the entered title, which initially is an empty string, the entered image URL, which initially is an empty string, and the entered description, which also is empty initially. And we then pack our memory data here. We create this object and set the title equal to entered title, the image URL equal to entered image URL, and the description here equal to this entered description. And then forward that along with our emitted event. Now we just need to bind these values here, and therefore on these Ion inputs, we can absolutely use two-way binding, even though these are Ionic components, but they do support it. We can use vModel there, and therefore we can bind the entered title here, the entered image URL here, and on the text area, we have our entered description, like this. Okay. Now we get this. This button can be set to type submit to be very clear about the fact that it will submit the form. And now we just need to make sure that this submit form method is triggered when the form is submitted. And for that, on the form, we add a listener to the submit event, and we point at submit form here. And I will add the prevent modifier to ensure that when it is submitted, we don't have the browser default of sending a request automatically, but that instead this is prevented and we let just JavaScript handle this. So that should all be working. That should add the memory. And now in the add memory page, we maybe then also want to navigate away once we submitted the form. So here in save memory, besides dispatching the action, I will also use this $router to programmatically navigate away. And we can do this by calling push on the router to go to /memories, or actually call replace because I don't want to be able to go back to the add form thereafter. I just want to go to the memories page without being able to go back to the memories form, because going back makes no sense when it was submitted. And replace ensures that we can't go back. So if I now save all of that and reload, we can enter some data here, like hiking, pick a nice image URL, and adding a description, click save, we go back, and we have our memory added here. And of course, we can also go to the details page then. This all works. So that's great. This works. This is how we can add our own data, our own memories. And with that, I already covered a lot of the core features you gotta know when working with Ionic and Vue. You hopefully see that in the end you're building a regular web app and you're using all the Vue features which you already know, like data binding and the options API and the router and Vuex. And this all works just as you know it, but then you add in certain Ionic components to get this beautiful look and mobile behavior out of the box with the Ionic component library here. Now, as a last step, I will now also ensure that we don't just have the dummy data and our own custom data like this with our remote URLs for images, but that we can take our own images and store them on the device. That will be the final building block of this introduction to Ionic and Vue. And of course, as part of that, we'll then also run this not just in the browser as this preview here, but as a real mobile app on an emulator and a real device. So at this point, we got our Vue Ionic application up and running. But you probably came here because you wanted to build a real native mobile app with Vue and Ionic. And up to this point, we only have a web app which looks very much like a mobile app, especially when we preview it in the browser with that mobile app preview feature. But it isn't a mobile app yet, it's a web app. But we can easily turn it into a mobile app with help of Capacitor. Capacitor is another tool developed by the Ionic company. So by the same team or the same company which also developed the Ionic component library. So the components give us the look, you could say, the look and behavior of a mobile app. Capacitor now is a tool to really create a mobile app. And it does create a mobile app based on a web app by basically giving us a shell, you could say. It creates a real native mobile app, which then internally hosts a web view, which hosts our web application. So it's our web application running inside of a mobile app. But it's still a real mobile app in the end, which you distribute through the app stores. Now, of course, since it's being wrapped, there is a tiny performance loss, as you can imagine, since there is a wrapper around your web application. But on modern devices nowadays, this isn't really a problem, and it's also not a big performance loss. Unless you're building a super performance-intensive application, which you're probably not building with Ionic anyways, there shouldn't be any problems at all, and you just gain a lot by having this easy way of building a real mobile app. Now, you might want to check out my comparison of Ionic, Flutter, React Native, and NativeScript, linked below the video, to learn more about the main options you have for building mobile apps, besides using the official languages, and how they compare. So Capacitor is a tool which wraps a web app, any web app, even if you're not using the Ionic components. This is not a prerequisite, and here's how we can use it. Obviously, you can visit capacitorjs.com, and there you find docs where you can learn more about using Capacitor, also in non-Ionic projects. If you do have an Ionic project though, as we do, using it is particularly easy. Here, we even have capacitors set up already. We got the capacitor config JSON file at least. But all we got to do here to enable a capacitor, even if we would have no setup at all, is run Ionic integrations enable capacitor. Run this command in your Ionic project, and this would enable and add capacitor if it wouldn't be enabled already. Here you see it already is enabled. You also find these steps in the official capacitor docs, of course, if you check how you can use it with Ionic. Now, once you did run this command, the next command you need to run to really set everything up for capacitor is npx cap init, and then an app name of your choice and an app ID of your choice. And these two values matter because these two values will also later be used when you deploy your app to the App Store. The app ID matters there. Every app needs a unique ID across the entire world. And the app name, of course, is the name users also will see. So let's run npx cap init here and pick an app name. I will go with Vue memories here in quotes since I have a white space in there, and then an app ID. And for the app ID, there is a clear best practice on how to pick a unique app ID. Use a domain which you own or which you could own, for example, one which includes your company name or your personal name, anything which probably is unique around the entire world, and then invert it. So for example, for me, I could use com Academind because Academind is my company. Academind.com is our website. Com Academind Vue memories, for example. And you shouldn't have a dash or anything in here. Instead, use a white space if you want to separate this, or just use one word. Now, this did set up this app ID here and the app name here in the capacitor config file. And now you need to add the specific platforms which you want to support. Android, iOS, Electron is possible as well if you want to build for the desktop, but we're going to focus on Android and iOS here. Now, before we can run the commands for that though, you need to make sure that you have your system, your operating system, your machine configured for Android and iOS development. And for that, you can check out capacitorjs.com required dependencies. There you learn that you need Node, we already got that. But then for iOS, you need a Mac. Unfortunately, that's a restriction by Apple. You need a Mac because you need Xcode. There is a way of building Ionic apps in the cloud with Ionic AppFlow, which is a service offered by the Ionic company. But this is not a free service, and we're also not going to use it here. But there would be this service if you want to build your app in the cloud and not install the iOS and Android dependencies locally. But I am going to install them here, and therefore you need to install Xcode, for which you need a Mac. Once you got Xcode installed on a Mac, run this command here inside of the terminal, and also run this command inside of the terminal. I already did that off screen, but you should of course do that to set up everything for iOS development. Now for Android, you need to install Android Studio, and you can install that on all operating systems, so here you are not restricted. Simply download Android Studio from developer.android.com. And whilst Android Studio, of course, is also an IDE for building mobile apps, here we download it because it also installs all the Android SDKs, which are used by Capacitor under the hood to create this wrapper app and to build this app. So simply download and install Android Studio. I'll not do it here because it takes quite some time. Make sure you install a recent Android SDK whilst going through that installer. And once you're done with all of that, you should have Android Studio and therefore all the Android requirements installed. Again, check out the required dependencies page here to see all the instructions in detail and to get all these links. And once you did all of that, you should be able to run these commands here. So here I'll run npx cap add Android to add Android, and I get an error. Now this is an error which I get because you need to build your app at least once before you can add a platform. And with build, I simply mean build your web app. Now here in Vue Ionic's case, we can build the app simply by running this build script here in the package.json file, or by running Ionic build, which under the hood will just run that build script. So this will now build our app for production, and we need to do that in order to then build it as a mobile app as well, because your mobile app wraps your production ready app. That's why you need to build it once. Now, once the build completed here, we can run npx cap add android again, and now this works, and now it sets up an Android project, an Android app project in this Vue Ionic project folder. Here it will then set up everything we need, and it will give us that Android app which is wrapping our Ionic, our Vue Ionic app. It gives us this Android folder, therefore. Now we can also run npx cap add iOS, at least if you're on a Mac. If you're on Windows or Linux, this unfortunately does not work, as I mentioned. But here I am on a Mac, so I can run it. And this will now install or set up the iOS app and all the dependencies for that. Now, once you did all of that, you can run npx cap open and then Android or iOS to open the respective development tools, Android Studio or Xcode, with that app, so with that app loaded into the tools, so that you can run your app through these tools on a real device or on an emulator to preview it. So here I'll run npx cap open Android, and this now opens up Android Studio with that built Android app, which is wrapping this Vue Ionic app. Here it is. And we're not opening this to edit the code, but really just to run the application, to test it and to preview it. And here I want to preview it on an emulator. Now for this, we need to wait until this is fully built and initialized. You see it here at the bottom of the screen that it's still building this. And once it's done building this app, so here the Android app is being built, is being generated, you could say. Once that is done, we can also run it on an emulator or on a real device. So let's wait for that to finish. Here we go, it's done. And now you can go to Tools here in Android Studio and go to the AVD Manager. This allows you to set up a virtual emulator, which allows you to run an Android phone basically on your computer so that you can preview your app in this emulator, in this simulator. Now, I already got a couple of emulators. You can click on Create to create a new one, and then simply pick one of the templates, like the Pixel 3, let's say. Click Next here, and then simply use a stable API version here. I'm going with Android 10 here. Click Next and finish. And now this sets up such an emulator, which we can now launch by clicking on this Launch button here. And now this launches this emulator on our system. It doesn't yet launch the app on it, but it launches the emulator already. Here it is up and running. And with that launched, we can close the AVD Manager and now launch our built Android app, so this wrapped Vue Ionic app, which was wrapped by Capacitor and which was now built as an Android app by Android Studio on that running emulator by selecting the emulator in this drop-down here, in this drop-down up here, and then clicking that Run button. And this will now launch our app, the app we built as a web app, which is now turned into a mobile app on that emulator. So this will take a couple of seconds, but ultimately the app should come up here and should be running on that emulator. Let's wait for that to happen. Here it is coming up. I will already say it is quite slow on this emulator because the emulator is not the fastest thing ever, because it's a mobile phone, an Android phone running on your computer, and it's also not optimized for production at all. So don't be confused if this is not super fast here. Now you will see, however, that this all works as shown, and we got our application up and running here. We can open up the soft keyboard here. We could add a memory, and we can navigate around here with all the features we saw in the browser as well. But now this is really a mobile app running on a mobile device, on an emulator, but still it's a mobile app. And we could, of course, now also build this and deploy it to the Google Play Store to distribute it to the world. This is how easy it is to build a real mobile app with Ionic and Vue. And it is a web app wrapped by a mobile app, of course, but no one can tell. It's super fast and smooth, and it looks and feels like a mobile app. It's the best of both worlds. You can leverage what you know about web development and about Vue, and you can build amazing apps in no time because you can use the existing knowledge. You don't have to learn a new programming language or a new tech stack, and you get real mobile apps which you can push out to the world. Now, we're not done. We're going to add the camera capabilities, but this is a great step forward, of course. So now let's work on this form and let's make sure that we can actually take an image with our device camera. And for that, we will use Capacitor, because Capacitor is this tool which creates a native app by wrapping the web app, but it's not just that. It's a library which also gives us a ton of plugins that allow us to communicate with the device on which the app is running. So for example, there are plugins which allow us to access the device camera. For this, you need to make sure that Capacitor is installed, and here I do have Capacitor, Core Android, and iOS installed. And it was installed when we enabled the Capacitor integration earlier. And with it installed, we can work on this create memory form component there, which is the component that manages this memory form. And I want to start with the interface. Currently, we have this input for the URL, but I no longer want to have that. Instead, I now want to have a button to launch the device camera and take an image, and then a preview of that image. And for that, we can, of course, again use an Ion thumbnail here for the preview. For this, of course, we need to import Ion thumbnail here from Ionic Vue and register this here. Whoops, Ion thumbnail. And inside of that Ion thumbnail, we could use an Ion image, and we would have to import and register this as well. Or to keep things simple, I'll use a regular image here with some source, which I'll set later. Now that's one thing. Besides that, I also want to have a button. So first of all, on Ion thumbnail, I'll add a slot of start so that inside of this Ion item, this thumbnail is positioned on the left. And then next to it, side by side to Ion thumbnail, in the same Ion item, I'll add a Ion button, which we already are registering, with an icon. So with an Ion icon, which should have a camera symbol and a text of, let's say, take photo or something like that. Now to use Ion icon, we need to import this, of course, and then also here register it. And I need to import the icon which I want to use. So we have to add an import from ionicons/icons. And here I will import the camera icon. Makes sense, I guess, since we'll have a button that opens the camera. And then here we have first of all have to return it in data, of course. So here I return camera, this camera icon which we're importing, as you learned it earlier in this video. And then on the icon here, I'll set the icon to camera. And I also want to add a slot here. And to find out which slots are supported, not just for the button, but for any Ionic element here, we can go to the official docs and then to the slots part. And we see that there is an end, an icon only slot, which we already used before, and a start slot. And I want to have my icon at the start of the button, so I'll assign slot equals start here to position this icon at this specific, nicely styled start slot inside of the button. And then we have the text in the default slot, so to say. If we do all of that, we go back to our application. This is what we get, and this doesn't look too bad. This is our button here. And I will actually change the button look a little bit, and I'll change it to fill equals clear. Again, the possible values here are something you can look up in the official docs to have this look here. Okay. Now, of course, we don't have an image yet, and we could display some placeholder here whilst we don't have one. We could render the image conditionally and show some fallback text whilst we're waiting for it, but I want to focus on the camera part, so I'll ignore this ugly image for now, and instead wire up this button. Now, to wire it up, we need a method which should be triggered when this button is clicked. let's say a take photo method. The name, of course, is up to you, but this method here should be fired whenever this button is pressed. So I'll go to this button and add a click listener and make sure that take photo is triggered, that we point at this method. Since this button is inside of a form, I'll also add type button here so that this button will not submit the form, because of course it shouldn't do that. The only button which submits the form is this button at the bottom, not this one. And if for now this method will get fired whenever the button is pressed. Now I want to use the camera functionality. And for this we will use Capacitor. On capacitorjs.com, you can go to the plugins area to find all the core plugins which are built into Capacitor. So all the core native device functionalities which are built into Capacitor, and there you'll find the camera. Here you find usage instructions, and you, for example, see that we need to tweak some things when it comes to permissions. Now let's start with iOS. Here in the iOS folder, which you only have on a Mac because you can't add iOS capabilities on Windows or Linux machines, but on a Mac, you should locate your info plist in this nested app folder here, and there you'll have certain key value pairs. For example, here for the camera usage and so on. And you want to make sure that these keys, which are specified here, NS camera usage, photo library, these two photo library usage keys here, that these keys exist here and that they do have string values. These string values basically are the text which will be displayed to your users when they are prompted to provide permissions. So when they are prompted whether they want to allow taking that photo or not. And therefore you want to make sure that you enter any text here which you want to present to your users. I will go with the default text, and therefore I don't need to edit anything here, but you should make sure that these key value pairs are set. Now for Android, you want to go into the Android folder, and there into the app folder, the source folder, main, and then to the Android manifest. And there you get a couple of users permission elements, tags, which you can add and remove. And by default, you should have a lot of tags here. When you deploy your application and when you upload it to the app stores, you of course want to remove all the permissions which you don't need so that you're not asking for tons of permissions, which typically leads users to not install your app, especially if the permissions make no sense for the kind of app you are deploying. For development, it's great that all these permissions are set here because it means we can easily use and play around with any plugin, with any capacitor plugin, and any device functionality of our choice. In this case, we should make sure that these permissions are set, read and write external storage, and that's the case here. Therefore, we don't need to change anything, but you should be aware of that. And you should clean up your permissions before you publish your application. But therefore, we are now ready to go. So in the create memory form component here, we now want to import certain things from @capacitor core. And to be precise, here we want to import plugins. Import plugins from capacitor core. And then go down to take photo, and we'll use the plugins there, or one specific plugin to be precise. To be very precise, we can actually go up and extract one specific plugin here from plugins by using destructuring, and that's the camera plugin. So here I'm using object destructuring in JavaScript to pull out the camera key value pair and store it in a new constant named camera. And that's the camera plugin to which we now get access through that constant. And here in take photo, we can now call camera.getPhoto, just like that. It's very simple. And this will actually return a promise to you because, of course, taking a photo is an asynchronous task. After all, the camera app will open up and the user has to take and confirm a photo. And therefore, of course, we can use async await here to await this operation. Alternatively, we could use then and catch and so on. But here I'll await this and I will get my photo here in the end as a result. Now getPhoto takes an object as an argument where we can configure this operation and how we want to take a photo. And we got various keys which we can set here, and of course the official docs are the best place to learn about all possible values. But for example, we want to set the result type here, and we want to set it to a specific result type based on an object or an enum-like object, which we also import from Capacitor core. And that's the camera result type object. We also can already import camera source. So make sure you add these two imports from Capacitor core because we'll need them to configure the camera. Because now for result type, we can access camera result type and then here choose URI, URI, like this. This basically means that the photo will be stored in a temporary location on the device and you get a URL, a pointer at that location, a path to that location in the result. In addition, we can set the source and we want to set that to camera source. And then here you can choose whether it should be the Photos app which is opened so that users can pick an existing photo or if you want to really open up the camera. And that's what I want to do here. And then, for example, we can also set the quality to a value between 0 and 100. And I'll go with 60% quality here to make sure that the image isn't too big. Now, there are way more settings which you can set. Again, definitely check out the official docs for that. So this will now take a photo and give it to us here in this constant. And now, of course, we don't just want to have the photo. For the moment, we at least want to preview it here in this thumbnail, in this image. And that's not too difficult because this photo which we get here is actually an object which will hold the path to that taken photo, and we can use that path to then preview it. It will already be a path which works with the image element. That's some convenience Capacitor gives us. So therefore, we can simply add a piece of data here, preview image URL, and initially that's an empty string, for example, or null. But then here, once we took the photo, we simply set this preview image URL equal to photo, and then there is a web path field. And that's this path to the image on the device, which can be used in an image tag to preview or to display that image. And that should already be all. If we now save that, that should work. Now here, I'll reload, open up the console to see any errors, and click Take Photo. And it now fails here in the browser. It then opens the image picker instead simply. It fails here because we needed to install an extra package or some extra elements to make that work. And it gives us a link where we can learn more about that, this PWA elements document here. And there you also learn how you could install that. This basically adds some extra web components which are needed to display a nice looking take an image in the browser modal to this web application. Really useful, but not what I want to focus on here. So I'll ignore that here and just live with that image picker fallback. Instead, we will test this on a real device, or at least on the Android emulator. And to test this, I'll stop this development server and then build the app again and again ship it to the real device, to the emulator. Now to preview this or to test this on our emulator, we first of all will run Ionic build again to rebuild this application because we always need that production ready build of our web application first. And once it was rebuilt, we'll again basically tell Capacitor to wrap its native app around this rebuilt, updated web app, and then we can launch that through the emulators and so on. So through Android Studio on an emulator or on a real device. And I'll simply do that by running npx cap copy thereafter. So this will now take the built application and again copy it into the native app folders, so into the Android and iOS folders, and wrap it with these native apps. And then again we can run npx cap open Android, in this case to open up Android Studio with this updated native app loaded in there. So now it's loading this again, and it's then building this again, and thereafter we can launch this on an emulator again. So let's wait for this build step here in Android Studio to finish, and then I'll again run this on my pixel-free emulator on which we tested this before. So this is the emulator starting up. Now the build of the updated app started, and here's the updated app starting up. And if I now click the plus here and I click take photo, I'm asked whether I want to grant this access, which I do. And now the camera app will open up. And the first time it opens, I get this, this little introduction here on the emulator. And I can take my photo, and I have to go back. But that's just the first time, because that's just an emulator thing where it tells me how to use the camera. Now if I take this again, I can take this dummy image in this emulator camera simulator, confirm this image, and it's taken. It's just not showing up here, which it of course should. So let's find out why this is not working. And of course the reason for this not showing up is very trivial. I'm not binding my image source. I should do that. I should bind my image source to this preview image URL, because otherwise updating this piece of data isn't worth a lot. So make sure that you bind your image source to this preview image URL, which we're updating. And once you did that, we can try this again. Now it might be cumbersome to always rebuild this. Theoretically, there is a live updating mode, which you can learn more about in the Ionic docs. So where the app on the emulator is live updated. But it never did work for me really well. So, well, here we are. I'm just rebuilding this. And I typically just test it in the browser anyways. And then it's just sometimes for these native device capabilities, which I don't need to test all the time though. So it's not really a big problem. So now I'll again run npx cap copy to copy this over. Don't need to run the open command again because Android Studio is still open. And I will now relaunch the app here, rebuild it, and restart the updated app on the emulator therefore. So let's wait for this build process to finish and for the app to launch again here. And it did restart here for me. And now let's try this again. Let's take a photo here. And this looks better. Now we got the preview here as well. Now if I enter the rest of the data here and save this, the image is not showing up here because currently we're not using that taken image. We're just displaying this preview, but we're not storing it when the save button is pressed. But that's of course the next thing we can do. We can make sure that this photo does show up here as well. And of course that's not too hard. Previously, we collected the entered image URL and we passed this along with our memory data. Well, now it's this preview image URL which we need in the end. And therefore, I'm not too happy with that name. Maybe we should get rid of the entered image URL and rename this to chosen image URL or taken image URL. And of course, also update this down here now in take photo and also bind this here in our preview. And then simply forward that when submit form is called, so that image URL is set equal to this taken image URL. And with that, the image will not just be used to preview it here, but the URL is also passed along with the image data into our Vuex store. Now that's all great, but still this is not ideal, because at this point of time, we're always passing around this display ready URL we get here from this photo object, here this web path value. This works, but it's only stored in a temporary location. We can't rely on this image to live on. And to ensure that it survives not just now but also in the future, we might want to consider storing it in the file system of our device. Now, this is something we can cover in a future video. If you want to, definitely let me know. And below the video, I will also provide a link to resources where you learn how you could do that, how you could use the file system capacitor plugin to store the image permanently. But for this video, I'll stop here because we can always continue working on this. We can always add more. But you now did learn and did see how you can build an Ionic Vue application. You learned what Ionic is, that it's a bunch of UI components, and how you can leverage your Vue knowledge to build a web app, and then based on that, with help of Capacitor, a real mobile app with Ionic and Capacitor and Vue. And you saw how the Vue router fits in, how Vuex fits in, how you still use what you learned about Vue, about methods and building templates and components, that all of that still applies, but how you can mix in these Ionic components and the Capacitor plugins to build real native mobile apps. If you want to learn more, definitely let me know, of course. Definitely comment below the video. Let me know if you want to learn more, what you liked, what you built, of course, also. And check out the official docs also to learn more about that and to build any mobile app you want with Ionic and Vue. Because these are two real amazing technologies and working with them is a lot of fun, as you hopefully also saw in this video.